share with you today a synthesis of our biological perspectives on cooperation and culture and learning, and really speak to how those insights can maybe help us address some of our most fundamental issues in society today. So the picture you see now is of a Yao honey hunter interacting with a bird called a honey guide, and I'm going to talk to this during my talk today, but it alludes to the idea that we humans, like all organisms, are actually interconnected with other life forms around us, right through from the producers through to the herbivores and then the predators, and then the cycling of nutrients back into our producers again. All life is interdependent. The issue we face is that humans are dependent on resource extraction for our society, and always have been. But at this point in time, we've reached the moment where we are overreaching, overextending what we can take sustainably from our environment. We are depleting our natural capital such that we're going to have less available for us in the future. At the very same time, we're increasing our demands. We can see this from overfishing, which depletes fishing stocks. We can see this in the exploitation of soil nutrients and the gradual deterioration of our agricultural productivity. We can also see this in the waste that we produce and how this damages our capacity to both engage further future resources, but also damages the life support systems in our own atmosphere. And climate change is not the biggest problem we face existentially, but it's certainly the most urgent one, and it interacts with all of these factors. So, what are we going to do about this? Well, the problem we face is that we aren't very good at these collective action problems. And this is called the tragedy of the commons, where we have these resources, these shared public goods. People will overexploit them. Everyone will just take a little bit more for themselves until we overuse that resource. And that's what unsustainable resource use is. Our current society is linear. We take as much as we can, we reject it. Now, can we resolve this problem? Well, the historical biological perspective would say no. And it would say no because we've lived in this mantra that says that life is selfish, that it's wild and tooth and claw, that it's a struggle for existence, that we're all competing, and that as such we'll continue to take beyond our needs and overuse our resources until we have societal collapse. And indeed, that has happened to some societies. A classic example is on Easter Island, where we overused resources until the society collapsed. So is this our fate? Well, maybe not. And the reason for that is that this perspective is very much out of date. It still prevails, especially in our Western society. But if you look, there have always been those who would take a different perspective. Now, back in the late 1800s, a particular prince, Peter Kropotkin, who was actually Alexander II's favorite page boy, came up with an alternate perspective. He actually promoted a view that mutual aid is as dominant as self-interest, and that where individuals can gain by cooperating with others, that they will do so. So yes, it's still self-interested, but self-interest can generate cooperation. And so sociability is as much a law of nature as mutual struggle. And this was derived from the same natural selection evolutionary theory as Darwin. But, unfortunately, Peter Kropotkin was also one of the fathers of anarchism. In fact, he played a major role in helping overthrow the Tsarist regime, and then fell out of favor as the Bolsheviks took the limelight. As a result, his politics, in a sense, muddied the water of his science and prevented many from adopting his perspectives, and they were lost for much of the 20th century. Only recently, however, have we returned to recognize the critical role that cooperation plays in life. In fact, we know that cooperation is ubiquitous, in fact, as dominant a force as selfishness, as Kropotkin suggested. We can see this in genes that cooperate for self-replication, to cells that do the same, and even multicellular organisms, where all the cells collaborate to generate the next generation, which have copies of themselves within it. We see this in our superorganisms like bees and wasps and ants, and even in societies featuring unrelated individuals, such as those in apes, cetaceans, birds, insects, you name it. These complex combinations of related and unrelated individuals cooperating exist in animal societies. Not only that, we cooperate between species. In fact, that's critical for life on Earth. The earliest organisms to move onto land were lichens, a collaboration between a fungus and an algae. Pollinators provide trees a means of reproduction for fuel in return. And we see that all of our trees and plants actually have fungal networks that help them acquire nutrients and water in return for sugars from the plants. So these cooperative components of our environment are critical for our productivity. They're even critical for us as humans. More cells in your body are bacteria that provide mutual benefits to you than are your own cells. We call this the microbiota, particularly in your gut. Not only that, we have co-evolved with species around us. Not only those species on which we prey or that prey on us, but also animals like the honey guide here. Honey guides actually lead people to honey, and then those honey hunters can extract the honey and give the honey guide a wax reward. And I had the privilege of working with this lady Claire Spottiswoode here as she undertook some research with the Yao honey hunters in Mozambique to illuminate the culture that they pass from generation to generation to enable them to work with the honey guides. This has been going on for 6 million years. So, given that life is cooperative, can this cooperation help us to generate further cooperation in our culture and also overcome our problems in our society? Let's have a little think about that. And I want to take a voyage through my own career and how I came to understand cooperation. Now, after my degree, I went off to the Kalahari Desert and I started studying cooperative societies. I actually worked on meerkats, and at that point in time, we didn't have meerkat manna, but it arrived when I was managing the research project there, and we produced 4 series of this awesome program. And the reason it was so successful, along with other meerkat documentaries, is that they have an incredible society. It's composed of mum and dad, who are a dominant pair, and then all their offspring, who rather than leaving home, stay and help the dominant pair raise more offspring because they live in a dangerous desert environment where there's limited food and lots of predators. The bigger the group, the better you do. I was also fortunate to stay there for 10 years studying meerkats and other animals. I even had my first child in the Kalahari. You can see her in the top right there. She's just pointing out the camouflaged meerkat. So why do they live in these cooperative societies? Well, the answer is that it's group augmentation. The benefits of staying and living in a group allow you to live, gain individuals who you can then leave with and start a new group of your own with. And meerkats do this in a number of ways. When the dominant female gives birth to pups, she'll need food, so she'll go off foraging, and her daughters and sons will stay and look after the pups. Not only that, they'll sometimes allolactate to those pups. And then once the pups are big enough to start foraging with the group, they'll actually go and find food items. Everyone in the group finds food and brings them to the pups. Meanwhile, they'll be standing sentinel to look out for predators using any available high object, such as my head or my bag in this case, and they'll collaborate to drive off predators. So that's a chicken in the top right that used to come and lay an egg on my bed every day in my house, and then in one particular instant, the meerkats were nearby and incurred their wrath. So they formed a sort of giant furry super ball there, which was chasing off the chicken. Now, within meerkat societies, we also learned that learning is critical for the transfer of culture. And all culture is socially learned information that's transferred both between and across generations. And in meerkats, they actually facilitate this learning using teaching. This was one of the first animals to demonstrate teaching. Well, for humans to demonstrate teaching in them, at least. And so what we see in a study done by a friend of mine, Alex Thornton, is that meerkats will attend to their learners. So if they have a young baby meerkat that needs to learn how to handle a scorpion, they'll actually bring it a dead scorpion. But if they've got an older one, they'll know to bring it a partially intact scorpion so it can get some learning experience of how to deal with the sting and the pincers. And first they'll bring them a scorpion with the pincers intact, but the tail snipped off, and then gradually they'll move on to a fully intact scorpion. And they pay a time cost for this, and it's been shown that those young meerkats that are given more learning opportunities by helpers actually gain better scorpion handling skills. So really quite incredible to show that teaching is happening in the animal world and that this is actually facilitating the transfer of social information over generations. Now, the issue of all cooperative societies is that they're prone to defection, to cheating. And while I was studying meerkats, I happened to notice that they interact with a bird called a fork-tailed drongo. And drongos actually provide a benefit to the meerkats. They are sentinels, they look out for predators, and then they catch prey disturbed by the meerkats as they forage, much as a seagull following a plough. But meerkats do something else too. They alarm call at the predators, and the meerkats all dash to cover. Pardon me, drongos alarm at the predators and dash to cover. And as a result, these meerkats have learnt to listen in on the drongos and really trust them. And that's where the drongo's trick comes in, because if they see a meerkat with a particularly delectable food item, like a scorpion or a lizard, they'll actually make a false alarm call. That'll scare away the meerkat, and they'll swoop down and steal the abandoned prey. And so this is that problem we see in these cooperative societies, deception. And I did my PhD research on drongos to demonstrate the tactics they use to keep their deception racket going. So if cheating breaks cooperation, how can we keep cooperation working? The answer is through punishment. This can be physical, this could just be sanctions, no longer interacting with cheats. And I undertook some additional research, which I'll show you here, where I tried to see if a model animal that punished the drongos for lying to it would actually teach the drongos to be more honest. And so I could control whether my model animal would give the drongo some food, or if it would roll over the food and cover it and prevent the drongo from getting it. And so I won't go into the details of the experiment, but suffice to say, I had to get a model which could drop food, and I had a little remote motor that could drop a mealworm on the ground, and then the drongo would learn to use alarm calls to scare this away. And I ran experiments, therefore, to see whether they could learn that punishment would enforce honesty. So I'll show you what that looks like here. The drongo's in the top left. You'll hear its alarm when the model drops a worm. There's the drop. Reveal. That was the drongo alarming. And down it goes and collects its little reward. So I worked with 20 drongos that have been trained to use this apparatus, and what we could find out from this is that, sure enough, if they are punished and I roll over the worm, then they'll learn to be more honest and produce more real alarms to predators than false alarms. So I'm now going to synthesize a broader set of understanding from biology around cooperative societies. Because in many societies, we see these complex interactions between non-relatives. And in these societies, reciprocity is the key. I scratch your back, you scratch mine. So both parties gain a resource. Oftentimes, one will have the resource sometimes, the other at other times. And what's critical is that they both have these repeated interactions. But if we expand the size of our society, we actually can move to multi-individuals. And if you have a reputation for being a cooperative individual, then others will interact with you. If you are not cooperative, others will not cooperate with you. And this mechanism can enable you to expand cooperation to larger societies. We see this in the blue-headed cleaner wrasse. These species feed on parasites on the outsides of fish that come to visit them, but they like to eat the fish's scales too. And if they cheat too often by biting scales, and other fish see this, then everyone leaves that cleaner wrasse and goes to others on the reef. And that's an example of reputation enforcing cooperation. If we build our societies further, we need a mechanism to punish individuals because they may be interacting with unfamiliar individuals all the time, and at the larger scale of society, we require institutions. And the rationale for this is that we give the institution a mandate to enforce our social norms, and they will do so to maintain cooperation. You can see this in the concept of a legal system and some form of justice. The problem, of course, is that whilst this can generate the super societies which are typical of humans, it still has a problem, and that is that we are still overusing our resources where they are a shared common good. We're failing to factor in the cost that this is imposing on our society as a whole. And indeed, many are benefiting from the overuse of those resources while others suffer the consequences. This environmental injustice is a major problem we face. So we still have that problem of the tragedy of the commons, even in a relatively cooperative society. The good news is that that original idea of the tragedy of the commons, which was proposed by a gentleman called Garrett Hardin, has to some extent been resolved by the work of a lady called Ellen Ostrom. For this work she received the Nobel Prize. And she did research on communities around the world and found that in fact, in many communities, they resolve their collective action problems and collaborate to constrain their resource use. One of those societies is the Haida Gwaii, who controlled their harvest of salmon each year to enable sustainable use of that resource. And the critical components that we see in societies that do this are that they have security, essentially a form of envelope where all have a shared interest. They have equality so that everyone benefits from the collective actions and everyone takes the same costs as well. And they have trust so that they can reliably be informed that others will undertake the same behaviors. And so these are the cultural traits that you have to have for a society to cooperate and resolve those collective action problems. And these are the traits that I would say we need to encourage in our society to help us resolve our own collective action problems. We do this via institutions. The UN has the Sustainable Development Goals, which very explicitly seek these aims. We see this in finance, of ESG, environmental sustainability and governments, or environment, society and governance. We see this in the ideas of the circular economy that many countries are trying to adopt now, where we reduce, reuse and recycle our resources. So what I say is we need to engender a culture that institutes security, quality and trust, and that teaches this. And indeed, we are seeing this. For example, a scout who helps an old lady across the road, I think they made a mistake and helped Alice Cooper across the road in this case, but the intention was correct. And that's what I would like to see, and I think that's the society that will enable us to achieve cooperation. It's a challenge on a global scale, but we can hopefully get there. Now, an emergent component of this talk has been that we are individuals, and yet we are also collectively acting as a society. You can see that acting in your own interests alone can be highly damaging. Conversely, only acting in the interests of the group and only being allowed to do what the group wants can inhibit what it is to be alive, to meet your own needs. And that is my last thought, is how our understanding of biology has helped us really understand our own place between our own self and society. Thank you very much.